Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me back there? I just want to say before we begin, this is a, Bob was saying historic night. He didn't explain exactly, I don't think, why that is. It's a wonderful night for Patricia and me and for some others here. There are 5 people here tonight, including me. Where's Randy? Come here, Randy. Okay. Gar and Janaki. Let's see. Okay, yes, 5 of us. One unconvicted defendant here. No lawyers. One convicted felon here, Randy Keeler. And 3 unindicted co-conspirators. Janaki, Gar, my wife, Patricia. Now, this is an amazing night for me and thanks to Bob for bringing us together here. This is the first time, first of all, I would say, of these 5 people, including me, the Pentagon Papers would not have come out without each one of these. Each one was necessary. Randy, it would, here, as you said in the movie, would not have occurred to me to copy the Pentagon Papers without his example of going to prison. Janaki converted me to Gandhian thought, something which is, it's in our lives very much, and we might talk about that. But also, whereas Gar came out after almost 40 years or something as the key person in distributing the papers, Mr. Boston, if you saw the movie The Post, but anyway, giving it to the manager, and by the way, no one involved in this was interviewed by the FBI. I guess I was never interviewed by the FBI when it come down to it, but they took an interest in me, but they did not get the names of any of these people because of the tradecraft of Gar Alperovitz here and the fact that we stayed off the phone totally. And now he, naturally, there were 2 other people in what I used to think of as the Lavender Hill mob, sort of, whose names they still don't want known under Trump or earlier under Ashcroft or Sessions or anything. Gar came out actually just a year ago in a wonderful article in the New Yorker. But for the first time tonight now, Janaki, who you saw in the movie, actually, and I missed seeing again the first part, but did it mention that she had, I don't think it did mention that she had been the one who first introduced me to the thinking of Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Barbara Deming, and others that changed my life and made me open to the example of what I saw with Randy and Bob Eaton, I mentioned in the film. But what is not mentioned in the film is that Janaki was in charge of getting us for 13 days, as we eluded the FBI, Patricia and I, underground in Cambridge, one house to another, arranging with graduate students and others from one day to another. And being of Indian citizenship, her lawyers had always told her, don't be deported. Don't come out at all. So she's not mentioned to that in the film or anywhere else. She is out for the first time tonight as and finally, as the co-conspirator here. And finally, my wife, the unindicted co-conspirator here, without whom, by the way, you saw Tom Oliphant in the movie, I just saw again, and he was at the program the other night in Boston, and I mentioned that he had been critical, actually. He wrote an article talking about the Pentagon Papers. It was the first time they had been described in print after an interview with me and after talking to Mort Halperin. That article came out in the Boston Globe, and for a year, I had been afraid of putting these papers, getting them more copies done so that the FBI couldn't get them all, by taking them to a commercial place, because I was afraid that someone would pick up the phone and call the FBI, and somehow they would realize that actually copies were made for private purposes, I learned later, by people. So I had not gotten around to trying to get more copies. When that article came out by Oliphant, we said, oh boy, this will be seen in the White House, which it was. Henry Kissinger called the Globe and asked for extra copies of that paper. The FBI will be down on us any moment. So Patricia said, you've been talking about making more copies for a year now. It's time for you to get off your ass and do it. And she went around and did a lot of the copying while we were still cutting off more top secret stuff. But I finally have to say, we're about to speak, watching that movie again, when I haven't seen it for quite a long time, reminds me, look, I'm 88 now, which means that I grew up a large part of my life objectifying women. And I am a recovering white male, as my friend Brian Wilson puts it. But still, every time I see this movie, I am reminded I am married to the most beautiful woman in America. None more beautiful in the world. So.
I'll just say a word here because I won't be on the panel, but this has been an amazing almost 50 years of marriage, and I feel so proud and gratified in being your co-conspirator partner wife.
So what we discussed was all three of our panelists would maybe speak each for a few minutes, reflections on their experiences or relevance for today, and then we would open it up for questions. So, Janaki, would you like to speak first?
No, let's have Gar first.
Okay, Gar.
Well, first, this is the most important thing, particularly in the era we now live with and the presidency we now have, is that people are taking risks right now. And the idea that serious and responsible people are willing to take risks to deal with important issues is very important. And it's not, my experience is that people, almost everyone has an opportunity. And Dan has shown that you can take risks. Given the current government, that's very important. So that the second thing I want to say, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that starts this, the lies that started the Vietnam War and cost 3 million Vietnamese lives and 58,000 American lives. 3 million people. They were lies and known to be lies. I was working I had worked in the State Department and was working in the Senate at that time, and we put forward, the senator I worked for, a resolution to try to stop that. It was obvious that it was a total lie at that point, and that many people, millions of people died on the basis of a phony lie. And that's going on right now. So the second thing that I want to say is the kind of thing that happened, the way the story unrolled, Dan wanted to get these papers out as fast as he could. They're huge numbers, 7,000 pages, something like that, 7,000 pages. And the small role that our little team played is we were able to break it up into bits and keep the story going for 3 weeks, something like that, so that chunk here, the Washington Post, there was a movie called The Post. They were the second one to decide and therefore reinforce the notion of the free press. And when they were closed down by the government, it went, I think, to the Globe, and then we took it to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then to the Chicago Tribune, and on for 3 weeks to try to keep the story going. And so that our little team, I think that was a small contribution we were able to make at the time.
You say, pardon, you say we, but you could well have said, that was Gar's idea, actually, as having worked on this sort of thing with the press before, which I had not. And it was I thought that possibly we needed to get it out, very quickly, all at once, more or less. And it was your idea. It wasn't we, it was Gar, actually, who said, let's do it one by one, piece by piece. Yeah.
Well, it was an experience that we'd had, and you could do this. So the issue is you got to make the choice. Dan was absolutely right. Get this stuff out as fast as you could. But there was a way politically to keep this in the press that long. Of course, will you tell the story about that?
What actually did, what was it in your background that made you realize that?
Well, I'd worked in the House and in the Senate as legislative director, and I was what they called a high State Department official at one point, working on some of these matters as well. So I'd learned some of the techniques from the insiders. But it was very important to do this. The other thing, lots of different people who are not mentioned here took very big risks. For instance, you saw the Cronkite interview. That was held in somebody's living room. That was breaking the law, aiding and abetting, and that person took a risk. And the people who drove the car to bring the CBS people there and to bring Dan there, who were graduate students, took risks. And the people here's a kind of story that was reported, I think, in the New Yorker article. These are hundreds of papers, and how do you get them to reporters? So I think one of them, maybe the Washington Post guy, came down and was at the Boston airport. And so then we went to a motel, and he was told to wait at the motel. And one of the graduate students took 150 pages of the papers, put it outside his door, and I called him with the alias name or saying, open your door. And cops and robbers, things like that, because it was very dangerous. The FBI was everywhere, and the graduate students were taking these big risks. So we kept the story going that long. But the bottom line is 3 million people were killed for nothing, for lies. And now we're facing another government we'll see.
Thank you. Just to follow on that, it occurred to me, I didn't mention why Patricia's role was so critical in urging me to get these extra copies. I had not imagined injunction. It had never happened in the country. It turned out the Times was worried about that from the beginning, as Jim Goodale revealed. But it hadn't occurred to me as an issue. And I didn't really expect the Times, actually, to come out with it, actually. They hadn't been that good on the war for some time. As a matter of fact, Neil Sheehan had told me he was having trouble getting in anything about the war at that point. He told me earlier. So I didn't really expect much from the Times. But without having made those extra copies, the purpose of which was to assure that there were enough copies around that the FBI couldn't get them all from me, so that from my jail cell, by my 10 cents a call or something, I could say, okay, go, put it out. But without those copies, we would not have had the copies to give to other newspapers when the Times was enjoined and then the Post was enjoined. And we didn't give whole sets to, I don't think, anybody else except the Post or the Times. But we gave large chunks of it to each. And that was solely because we just wouldn't have had those if Patricia. Now, if the Post and the Times had, if that had been all, then the judges would have been faced with the fact that it's over, we've got it stopped, and they would have upheld the injunction, 5-4, almost surely. And the reason that it went 6-3 the other way was that within a week or two, thanks to Gar and getting this stuff out, and to Janaki, who kept us away from the FBI, the issue of enjoining it was moot. You couldn't stop it. It was the largest wave of civil disobedience, not only by the press in this country, but I would say the press in any country, or any institution known to be in history, of one paper after another, defying a president who said this is treason, this is defying the national security, the Attorney General saying all this, in the paper one after another saying, we don't agree with our First Amendment, we think we have a right to put this out. All of them putting themselves in line of prosecution as Gar was saying, along with me, and I want to get to Janaki, but I want to put to you a question first, Janaki. you were arranging those extra graduate student, weren't they all, essentially housing, with the help of these two friends of hers who remain anonymous, like the current whistleblower. And my memory is that no one said no to you. I think of one exception. But with one exception, my memory, and you enlarge on this if you would, is the way I got it secondhand from them. We have something here that may help shorten the war, but it may put you in great legal jeopardy. Are you willing to do it? And my impression was, in those days, everybody you approached said yes. Am I wrong or right?
No, you were absolutely right. The people that I asked, no one really, except one exception, said that they would not do it. And my question to them was, and we had all been involved in the, many of us, in the Black students movement at Harvard at that time, and in the anti-World Bank, and anti-Vietnam, and the civil rights. So the streets were alive in that sense. And people said, of course, whatever you want. And I said, well, you'll have to leave your apartment for a couple of days. And they did. And there was no problem with that. I think there are lots of stories like this, which are very important as part of the actual tactics of how we should do this. But this was 50 years ago to the day. So you look at us now, and you look at yourselves, and the tendrils and the filaments that were at that time still exist now. The lies exist now. And in my 78 years, there's not been a single year that I know where there has not been a war. And I think Dan is going to talk about this tomorrow, and I hope you'll come and bring people, because it's about unending war and dollars and catastrophes and why we do this. And that, I think, is the sword that should poke us to be able to get up and do something. But Dan, I was going to ask you a question. First of all, I must say that I want to pour libations to our ancestors.
What? I'm sorry.
Pour libations to our ancestors on whose path you trod, because there have been in humanity, in human history, like Sankofa from Ghana, the bird that looks back but learns from history and moves forward. We will not repeat history, we will change it. And we have Stephen Biko. We have Nandanar in South India, who's anti-caste, Sojourner Truth, the names that we all know and don't know. And Dan, with his great sense of humor and lucidity, was on this path, and there was just no saying no to him at all. And those were 7,000 some pages, and we all had them, and people said yes, and that kind of cataclysm of the spirit, going from somewhere where we do not wish to go towards constructing a world that we wish to construct. And nobody's going to do it for us. It's not like leaping into a rosy pond. No, it's going to be difficult. The struggles are going to continue. Because the state, which we haven't learned to question yet, whether it's the BJP in India or whether it's Xi in China or anywhere else, and here, do not question the state as being the executive committee of the profit makers. And it's the profit makers who are destroying us and filling themselves and gorging themselves with the blood of labor. And so the secrets by which that they perpetrate and pretend that that we will not question because of the making all of the reality invisible by something called democracy. What is that? How do we question that? How early do we question it? As a matter of fact, there are here in the audience several teachers from Vermont who are in this training program, which actually teaches children to question more, as he said, and to question what power is in the hands of the state. Why are we so easily convinced that the state is exceptional in this country and is somehow pure and did something which was an aberration in the Vietnam War? No. Let's forget the previous genocides, and let's forget the plantations. This is all on a particular pathway which he betrayed, which he became an enemy of. And so how do we, I as a Brahmin, how do we betray our ancestors and become an enemy of them when that is needed? And even though there is no roadway, no path that's spelt out by GPS or by the surveillance masters, and it's up to us to find the path. And do we have the courage to do it? He had the courage to do what he did. And Gar it was amazing to watch him go from telephone booth to telephone booth in Mass Ave. I am Mr. So-and-so, and persuading people, at the beginning. And of course, at other times, people wanted the stuff so they could put it out. But all of these stories of the anti-war movements of the time are there for you to laugh about, be delighted about, give you courage. But that's all that is. This has happened in the past. But it didn't happen in the past because both of them certainly are doing that work now. And so Noam Chomsky said, well, what should I do? He'd say, do more and do better. So there we go.
Great. Well, question. So, who would like to ask the first question? Okay, in the back.
This is for Janaki, and you spoke of, the film spoke about the defeat of the U.S. imperialist regime. Sorry, is this on? Yeah. As being key to Dan's decision. And I'm wondering what else was happening in the world at that time that might have influenced your decisions.
There is never a moment in history when the struggle is not continuing in this kind of way between... Sorry. Sir, please repeat the question, would you? The last part, I didn't quite get it.
Sorry, I'm struck that there was the war against the Vietnamese people led by this imperialist force, and they were defeated. And that led a lot of people to decide to kind of bring it down, right? But a lot of other things were happening in the world at that time that shaped our consciousness in this country. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about what that was and what it felt like. You mentioned the streets were alive, but they weren't just alive in the US, they were alive globally. I'm wondering if we could hear a little bit about how that might have influenced your thinking.
Such as where?
Such as all the liberation movements in Africa, and such as China, and I'm sure you can continue.
I spent 10 years in East Africa at the time of the liberation movements, and those indeed were enormously courageous people who questioned and fought against, in all different kinds of ways, fought against those that had raped the mother continent from which we all come, and had done so for a long time. And that was going on at this time. And of course in China, until 1979, and this is really, I'm glad you asked that, because there have been huge numbers of people who have not wanted the world to stay the way that it has stayed, which brought us to the Vietnam War, and the horrific nature of that. And this has happened many, many other places as well. When the British Raj took over India and Sri Lanka, and what did they not do? But these struggles have had enormous consequences. For example, in the early years I was in China, we had a very equitable and incredible society in which I lived. But it ended with the rise of the wealthy again in 79 and 89. So the question before us is, what do we want? Are we ready to study the past? Are we ready to study about these class struggles, which do not automatically and in one blow get rid of the caste system or the torture and the mayhem that humans seem to? And whether it's the Holocaust in Israel or the continuing by those very people on the Gaza, on Palestine, what is it that will make us shift the axis? And in this room, we have enough people to shift the axis as this person did at that time. Yeah. There is no excuse.
I want to underline that last point because I sometimes put it this way, I'm talking to the person sitting in your seat, and that's what Janaki's saying. In the end, there's something that each of us can do, even now. And so it's a mistake to look at this as a historically important event. It is a historically important event. But this is a really bad time in American history. And the issue that is posed by the Pentagon Papers and by Dan's courage is very personal. I am talking to the person in your seat. What is it, when you look at the mirror tomorrow morning, that you could actually do rather than listen to us talk? That's the issue always. So I don't want to preach about it, but it really is a bad time in American politics and history that each of us can address personally in some way. So that's the story of the Pentagon Papers. That's the story of Dan. In your own life, what is it you could reach to? Dan happened to see these papers and could use them and then take a risk of going to prison for the rest of his life. But there is a choice in almost every day if you look in the mirror. You could do something. And this is a real bad time. 3 million people were killed in Vietnam for no reason, based on lies. 3 million people by us, Americans, and 58,000 Americans. It's a lot of people.
Thank you. My name is Megan Sorensen. I'm a journalist for the Massachusetts Daily Collegian, which is the newspaper here. My question was, as I go into journalism, what is your opinion on how Donald Trump or the president treats whistleblowers and I guess all that he's spoke about? What's your opinion on all that commentary coming from the White House at this time?
What is your opinion? Donald Trump, you talk about Donald Trump, what is your opinion right at this time?
Well, of course, Donald Trump's concern with this particular whistleblower, which is irrelevant at this point because the information is out. The question of testimony is, as I think as Schiff and the others are saying, is essentially irrelevant at this point. Yes, indeed, this whistleblower, quite explicitly, she or he, and I hope it is a she because everybody's been assuming it's a he. It would be nice if it turns out it is a woman, like so many other whistleblowers. But was explicitly saying that it was hearsay, that it was secondhand, and so forth, but was not sent to the IG, to the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, or rather, I'm sorry, he was not supposed to send it to Congress by the law until he had checked it out. It was a he in this case, had checked it out, which he did, and we're getting some of that testimony now from the people. So the original whistleblower is essentially irrelevant. It was the information. And as I said in this thing, documents make the difference. See? And without that piece of paper, we saw, the transcript, none of this would be happening now in terms of the investigations. I have said that this whistleblower is in significant danger even now, and therefore I hope her anonymity does remain. And if she testified, it's hard for me to believe the Republicans would not reveal who this person is, on whom the president has painted a bullseye on the back. This president is the first one that I know of explicitly who appeals to a vigilante constituency. And essentially this, who will rid me of this troublesome whistleblower? He's actually called a traitor and a spy, and I think would be in definite significant danger. And I say that as someone who, it turns out, and is it in, I guess it's not in the film, it turned out in the trial, 12 former, not former, CIA assets, as they call them, led by Hunt, who was mentioned here, and G. Gordon Liddy, were brought up from Miami with orders to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally. And on May 3rd, 1972. And when the prosecutor, and that came out as a result of Watergate, when the prosecutor said, rather I said, what does that mean? Kill me? And he said, the orders were to incapacitate you totally. But you have to understand that these guys are CIA assassins and assets and whatnot. I guess asset is short for assassin. Actually, they were, in fact, included people who had been, in fact, assassins for the CIA. He said, they never used the word kill. These euphemisms like neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, and so forth, incapacitate. So when I say this person is in danger of a plot instigated by the president, in this case called for by the president quite openly, I'm not just making something up here. I had that experience from the White House. And if they believed, as Egil Krogh said, they were worried about what else I knew, what else I would put out, including nuclear threats. And by the way, it comes back to me, Gar, I'm sitting next to, many of you do know him, I'm sure, Gar Alperovitz, but he was the person who first revealed the lies surrounding the Hiroshima bombing and the decision to drop the bomb. In his book, Atomic Diplomacy, and then later, what's the name of the encyclopedic book, The Decision to Drop the Atomic Bomb?
Yeah, the decision to use the atomic bomb.
Yeah, right. Terrific. And revealed that, which I'll be talking about in the next couple of days on both these talks. But, and by the way, something else comes to me, Gar, if I'm not mistaken. Were you not a critical person or an active person in the Mississippi summer? Am I wrong?
I did. I was working in the Senate trying to help the people in the Mississippi summer.
Yeah. So we're talking about activists here. And something occurs to me when I was listening to Janaki. Whistleblowing, of course, is a form of civil disobedience in terms of, not in terms of our Constitution, but in terms of the way the Espionage Act has been interpreted lately. First, with me. It was never meant to be used against Lakers, but Nixon experimented with that against me, and Obama used it 3 times more than all previous presidents. There had only been 3 before me. Before Obama, I was the first to be prosecuted under this. Bernie Sanders last week was the first American politician to say, or candidate for president, but really any politician, to say, if I am president, I will not prosecute any whistleblower or leaker under the Espionage Act. And no congressperson has made any such suggestion up to this time. And it's absolutely right. And when Janaki was saying how I go in the footsteps, very obviously, of people, God, I was not the first leaker by any means. I was the first to be prosecuted, but I had put out 7,000 pages, so it was a little hard for Nixon to ignore. But as other presidents had done, since they don't have an official Secrets Act to this day in this country, because we have a First Amendment. We don't have a British Official Secrets Act, except that all of these presidents since Nixon have been using the Espionage Act as if it were an official secrets act. And Julian Assange is the first journalist to be indicted now, or editor, by anyone. And not all of them have drawn back from that. Though actually, again, not in the film, but Jim Goodale revealed in a memoir he wrote, was in the film, that Nixon had not only intended, but they thought was fully intending, fully prepared to indict Neil Sheehan, Hedrick Smith, and others on the New York Times in a Boston grand jury, which was ended because of the way my trial was ended with the government criminality. So there was an earlier attempt to do that, but no other president till Trump now on Julian Assange has used the act against a journalist. And I might say, by the way, that so many people hate Julian Assange or have contempt for Julian Assange, and some with not bad reason, actually, and a lot without good reason. But the fact remains that if he is indicted, he is indicted. If he were convicted, if he were extradited and sent back to this country, I believe under the current state of the law and with the current judges that have been appointed, he would be convicted, and we would have a full British Official Secrets Act here, essentially of censorship of the government. But finally, what I started to say, when Janaki was talking about movements, something is happening right now, I think, of very great significance. As I said, whistleblowing, I thought I would go to jail forever. So it was a form of civil disobedience, which I was learned from Janaki and Barbara Deming and Martin Luther King and others in that example. And Gandhi often said, I invented jail going. Well, that's obviously not right. Thoreau, as far as I know, and Tolstoy had backed him a phrase, invented jail going against the Mexican War, by the way, and slavery. But Gandhi invented mass jail going, and which I take very seriously, had a big effect on me. I invented mass leaking, all right? But unfortunately, I waited 39 years for the next mass leak, and that was Chelsea Manning. And I'd essentially given up on encouraging anybody to do it, which I thought of, you generally have to have that much kind of material to show people what's really going on, what's happening. Now, this current example is a very unusual case of a single page actually conveying quite a bit of a message. But I waited for them, and 3 years later, Snowden. And that's about it. So we can't count on that. We just can't. It's people don't, in the government, could have an enormous effect. There are, I would say, this is just a figure minimum, 1,000 people who know now of planning for war against Iran, who know about the decision-making leading up to Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, all these others, who have not spoken out. 12 people at least 12 people, heard the president commit a crime on the phone, on this Ukrainian conversation. Not one not only told the president, as far as we know, hey, you're in trouble, we gotta change this, we gotta fix it. What they did was lock it up, classify it, and did not tell the public about it, reveal. Now we're beginning to get some leaks. But the thing that strikes me is, putting aside people in the government, a 15-year-old young woman in Sweden, Greta Thunberg, who we met, Patricia and I, while she was still 15, while she had 60 people outside the parliament, sat in front of the parliament by herself on a weekday, out of school, violating school regulations. People called for a prosecution later, when it became more important, with a little sign with the word on it, which was not demonstrate or protest, but strike was the word she used. She said, this is a school strike. And I call people to do that. She sat there every Friday We were with her. There was about 60 people in a snowstorm when we happened to be in Sweden, and I went on Friday to be with her. 2 months later, 1.6 million school children in 120 countries struck on a school day. What is needed is for them, in other words, that's not just demonstrating on a Saturday, on a day off and so forth. It's striking. And what is needed, I believe, in the climate issue, which is what she's looking at, it will not change. She has not yet awakened, as far as we can see, the parliaments she has spoken in front of, but she couldn't be more uncompromising in them. And the fact is, if those young people whose future is not just endangered, it's practically foreclosed if things go on as they are. They have no future to speak of, as she's saying, unless there's change. If they can get their parents and the other grown-ups to do what they have not done on their own initiative and join those strikes, like the Extinction Rebellion in London and elsewhere, there's a chance.
I want to just add one thing to this. I want to add one thing about this. First, Dan, I want to get you to look at a book. Dan has published an extraordinary book on nuclear weapons. And the issue, which is Dan's knowledge and specialty base, and it is coming forward. This year will be the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima. It is time for us looking that one directly in the eye. And a good place to start was Dan's book, but also with Greta's action. What is it we can begin to open up that issue? It is that Donald Trump is sitting there with nuclear weapons, and the ball is in our court, and it is coming right up now. Anyway.
Hi, my name is Anna Olson. I'm a senior here at UMass. Sorry, that's my phone. This question kind of began ruminating midway through the documentary, so I had to write it down just because layers kept getting added, so I apologize if it's a little bit lengthy. Dr. Alperovitz, you mentioned the different people taking risks in the process of releasing the Pentagon Papers. You, Dr. Ellsberg, journalists, your graduate students, the taxi drivers. But one notable group that was missing who didn't immediately take action were the lawmakers, elected officials who we elect to serve the very purpose of upholding integrity and democracy, which is the same purpose that these risk takers were doing it for. So my question to you guys is, why didn't the lawmakers you initially gave the Pentagon Papers to feel compelled to act? What were the risk factors that they were considering that other risk takers and other actors in releasing the papers may not have been considering? And what are the implications of these risk factors on the way our political system affects democracy? Sorry, that was really lengthy.
Yes. Actually, Senator, all right. Senator Fulbright and Senator McGovern and Senator Mathias and Representative McCloskey each promised me they would bring these papers out in hearings. Now, I believe that McCloskey, when he says, I believe McCloskey, he's a very good guy, when he says, I was intending to do that, I wanted, they were first requesting them directly from the chairman of his committee. Now, Laird had refused those papers twice to Fulbright, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. Just refused, didn't claim executive privilege or anything, just said, no, we won't give them to you on a classified basis. But Fulbright had said they would hold hearings. McGovern also, they didn't. Effectively, as Fulbright's assistant Orville Jones told me, in effect, paraphrase later, let Ellsberg do it, because each one could see consequences. And Fulbright there was no question of prosecution of any of these people. They all assured me correctly. In fact, 2 of them took the Constitution off the shelf and read me the passage. They could not be questioned about these papers if they spoke in Congress, clause in Congress. So no question of prosecution. But, for example, Fulbright afraid that they would give on the excuse that he put out classified information, they would take away foreign military aid from foreign affairs, which he was in, and give it to armed services, which was much more conservative. So
Committees, armed services committees,
what?
The committees.
The committee, yeah,
Yeah.
they would give it to the committee. Matthias, they would give him, I won't go through all this, the Goodell treatment. He was a Republican, and Goodell had been he's not in the film, but had been dismissed essentially from the Republican Party for having called for the end of the war in Vietnam. McGovern was going to run for president, and your old boss,
Sonny Nelson.
Gaylord Nelson, convinced him, after McGovern had said he would put them out, Gaylord Nelson, for whom God was no longer working, told him, you can't do that as a presidential candidate, you know. And by the way, I could understand that. I never held that against me. I had raised it myself, you know, can you really run for president if you do? He said yes at the time, before talking to Gaylord Nelson. My donors are separate from the Democratic Party regulars. I can do this. But Gaylord said not. Each one of them having said that they would never reveal my name they couldn't be questioned. And my attitude was, I'd rather not be named, like this whistleblower. You know, I don't know. This whistleblower has a way of doing it legally through the Whistleblower Protection Act that didn't exist in my day. So there was no way to do it legally unless you read the Constitution and, you know, sort of said, it must be legal to tell Congress of criminality, you know, what's going on. But no. So each one of them, McGovern was running for president, McCloskey was running for president in the Republican Party. So they each held press conferences as soon as my name had been, or rather before my name had been used, and brought my name out. We were underground, thanks to Janaki. I went out from a motel and I got on the phone and said, what is going on? What are you doing? I haven't been arrested yet. Well, as Goodell told me later, Dan, when you're running for president and you have a chance to be on the 5 o'clock news, you cannot turn that down. So in effect, no example of the courage, the risk-taking that God was talking about. It is zero. And I remember in 2006, actually this is something very current, with Conyers, my congressman from Detroit. I'm from Detroit. And Conyers was my congressman. And it so happens, I met him a number of times. He came out in 2005 as head of the Judiciary Committee, House Judiciary Committee, with a book on why George W. Bush was totally impeachable, 10 different ways, including the war in Iraq, which was clear-cut crime of aggression, crime against the peace, as much as any aggression in history, and I mean any aggression in history. And that was just one of the counts they wanted to go. So he wrote a little book on it in 2005. So I remember saying to people, though I didn't have great hopes for Congress in general with those things, I used to say, 2006, you know, it's a congressional thing. If we get the Democrats in there, which we did, if we get the Democrats in, John Conyers becomes the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, which is what indicts, what impeaches. We get impeachment for this, right? Well, we didn't. And the reason we didn't, I was told by somebody in Conyers' office, his aide, was right after the election, Nancy Pelosi, then the Speaker of the House, came into him and said with, quote, the most steely glance, look I have ever seen on a person's face, said to John Conyers, who, as you all know, I presume, just died, unfortunately, at 90, said, there will be no impeachment. No impeachment. And I said, what did he say? And the aide said, well, he didn't say anything. He sat there. And there was no impeachment. And now there was a good reason. I mean, there was a reasonable reason for it. The reason was it'll bring the Republicans out to vote in 2008, and we'll never get a Democratic president in 2008 if we go for impeachment in 2006 or 7. Well, that's a strong argument. Of course, it's the same today. It's why Pelosi was against impeachment today, for the same reason. Looking back on it, I think that it was extremely costly to the world and to this country that George W. Bush was not impeached for that aggression, because in effect, it accepted the idea that a president is beyond the law when he acts with the military. When he sends the military in, you can't impeach for that. And the same thing had happened with Nixon. They wanted to get Republican backing, which they did get in those days. Notice the difference from today, very striking. A different set of Republicans. They wanted to get it, and the Republicans would not go along with a count that he had committed aggression in Cambodia, which he had. So they had to drop that count. So the effect here is that Obama clearly went against the Constitution in Libya, elsewhere, et cetera. In effect, up till now, it really is. You can't get a president for foreign policy, for military affairs. Article 2, Section 8 is essentially written out of the Constitution, as far as I can see. President Trump sends tanks to Syria, having said he was getting out of Syria. He's sending tanks into Syria. He says publicly what other presidents only say privately, it's for the oil. Okay? But wait a minute. That is, again, blatantly against Article 2, Section 8 with the Congress and the UN Charter. It's clear aggression, not anything unprecedented. Only point I want to make is it's without any comment. Who have you heard that comment from other than me? Anybody? Do I see a hand? Have you heard that comment that what is going on with those tanks is absolutely illegal domestically and internationally?
I have a question about this. I have to ask you a question about this. And that is, sorry. To ask you a question, the first statement, that in this political economy, in the world, poverty and wars are necessary in order to protect the profit makers. Profit maximization cannot occur without that. So the second question is, when you ask a question about lawmakers, then you also have to ask the question of who does the state serve? What are the contrivances of laws, which are contrivances, who do they serve? So when you ask questions like this, the visibility becomes a bit clearer to realize that this is not an exceptional country, exceptionality. Let's examine history. Howard's taught us how to do that. And go beyond what we have been taught by teachers.
So I want to just answer also the question that you asked, very briefly, if I can, and endorse what Janaki said as well and what Dan said. She's talking about changing the system, and how do we do that? And I'm totally into that. That's what I work on every day. But I do want to ask, you're asking about these congressmen and senators and what can we do? And I want to I remember during the beginning of the Vietnam War, and also even earlier, we go back a long time, the people at this table, to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was working in the House of Representatives at that time. I was a young 22-year-old, I think I was at that age. And a bunch of kids from Toxin, which was the predecessor of SDS, came to this office of this young liberal congressman I was working with. And how do we stop this? What can we do? And the young women would say, sidebar, the young women were saying, I understand Kennedy likes girls. We could maybe sacrifice ourselves. It was that level. But the answer was, and it's a very simple answer, and it takes us away from those guys in Washington. And the answer is that, by and large, most members of Congress and most politicians are like weather vanes. Are like weather vanes. And if the wind doesn't blow them in one direction, they will not move. It has nothing to do with most of them. It has to do with us and whether we make the wind blow in a different direction. And so I think all of these questions, we're deeply involved in policy and all of that, but they all go back to whether or not next morning and you look in the mirror, you say, am I going to do something? It's about making the wind blow. It is not about listening to kind of us talk about this or what they ought to do and talking about the bastards who are running the White House. It's about whether we actually get off our duff and do something in the morning. So it's about making the wind blow. And so I want to take it always back to that question, not them out there.
Well, may I just pick up though on what Janaki said and what Gar said in between to a degree. Yes, the wind, which way is the wind blowing? But you know, the wind with dollars in it, a flood of dollars, comes from one direction and it ain't from us, basically. And so when you say it's up to us, if I may say, Gar, I think what you're saying, and in line with what Janaki is also saying, is who is going to challenge and counteract the influence of the corporations and the profit makers of all kinds, if not us? Exactly. It's not going to be the lawmakers themselves. If somebody is going to counteract it. Now, you asked earlier, I was going to ask you again to answer your own question. Why do we accept this, or why are we so easily fooled? I'm afraid there's something of a species problem that comes in here, but
Don't say it's genes, please. What? Don't say it's genetic.
Don't say what?
Don't say it's genetic.
Genetic.
Don't
no.
say it.
Oh, that's a long discussion we'll have later, not on this. And we don't start from the same point at this moment, on this point. But in terms of what can be done, by the way, it reminds me that we did see Gravel in this, he was the single senator who had the guts, to try to read the Pentagon Papers, and was saved from censure, and he knew he might be kicked out of the Senate as a result of it. He told his wife that. And in fact, well, I won't go into the whole story, but anyway, he did show a kind of courage, or not just kind, he showed courage. So after 2006, when I've mentioned, I had this great disappointment, What good has it done to have the Democrats in power in 2006? So I was talking to Mike on the phone, and I said, Mike, would you say that this crew of Democrats is unusually cowardly? And he said, no, usually cowardly. The same as in my day. But okay.
Let's so Randy, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Randy.
Someone asked earlier about, or I think, where is she now? Why aren't the lawmakers sticking their necks out and so forth? And Gar, you talked about, what each one of us can do. What should we look in the mirror? I'm reminded that the best advice I ever got as I was about to go to prison was from somebody who had been in prison a generation before me, who said, don't let them give you anything, the prison authorities that is, that you're afraid to lose. No privileges, special place in prison, early release because of good, so-called good behavior. They'll have you on their hook. And you wrote a brilliant paper once, I'm sure you remember it, about why people in the executive branch, for example, don't speak out, don't say what they know. And you went into the psychology, well, and you said it a little bit tonight, people, they're worried about their career, they're worried about their reputation, they don't want to be expelled from the fraternity of people that they have come to respect and whose respect they want. And that's all so true, and it applies also to all of us. What is it we have to lose? And when I got out of prison, I think it was the same guy who was a World War II veteran who said, you can do all this demonstrating because you're young, you don't have a home, you don't have a family yet, you're not yet married, but watch out what you acquire as you get older, because if you have anything you're afraid to lose, you will be kept from speaking out. It will be a threat. And the other thing that I've learned in some speaking I've done to high schools and colleges is people will say, whether it's the excuse or the real thing, what good will it do? You won't influence anybody. It's futile. Why take the time? Why expend the energy? You can speak out all you want. You can write a letter to the editor. You can sit down, do civil disobedience. But it won't move anybody. And I say, I gave a speech once. Who knew that you were in the audience and what you would do just hearing me?
That's right. That was great.
Hello, Dr. Ellsberg. First off, I want to say that this is like an amazing moment for me because I'm standing in the presence of an individual who was very important in the anti-war activism and against Vietnam, and I'm just so amazed. And thank you for coming to our school. I really do appreciate it. It means a lot. I have a question because I read about you before I came to this event. You believe that Julian Assange, he should not be in trouble, but there is the potential that he might have conspirated with the Russian government to have Donald Trump be president. And so my question to ask you is, how come you still think that he should be free? I'm just curious about it. So that's...
Yeah, I think I got that. I don't, okay. First, Julian was in essentially one room for 7.5 years. Now, he is in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. Apparently, as is understandable, his cognitive functioning has been significantly impaired in this. He's been tortured, in effect. I then don't judge very much the judgment. First of all, what can I say? I believe that the way, I've never said this in public, but I'll say it, because I am so concerned about something I read today about Julian, so it's on my mind. I have to get much more active in trying to get him out of that jail as a human being. Somebody sent today a petition saying we've got to send a petition, not a petition, but a representation or something, to the Queen, to the Parliament, they had a very eloquent statement actually about how it was a shame to the English as to how they are treating this person, and that he's in prison at all, and so forth, and that his only charge against him, which is not in Sweden, is in America for clearly a political crime. And what is the political crime he's committed? Of revealing the collateral murder that Chelsea Manning had revealed. Not for anything he did in 2014 or 15 or 16 or anything like that, some of which I would say is very questionable judgment, except that I cut a friend a lot of slack who's been in one room for 7 years, and I don't know what kind of judgment I'd be revealing, so I don't judge him too severely on that. But what he's charged with is what we did, is what we all did. Actually, except not as journalists. We were sources. He's actually charged as a journalist, which is, I explained earlier, is even much worse. With putting out information that deserved to be out, and which they were told at the time, the press who used it, there is blood on your hands, and on his hands, and on Chelsea Manning's hands, then Bradley Manning. They have not come up with one example since the year 2010, that is 9 years ago, of a single individual harmed by those revelations in that. Whereas, of course, what he was revealing was widespread torture in Iraq by our Iraqi allies, to whom we were handing people over to be tortured, as we handed people over to Assad in Syria to be tortured. and so forth. Okay, so that's the kind of stuff he was revealing. Should, in short, he be absolutely free to those charges and not extradited and allowed out of that cell? Absolutely, and I have no thinking. It's got to be done on human grounds right now. By the way, I'll tell you somebody else who's in jail now. How many people who know that Chelsea Manning has been in jail now for nearly a year? How many people here know that? Okay, how many did not know it? Nobody did not know it? Come on. Okay, but anyway, and why? For the same reason you saw on that screen. Tony Russo refused to testify to a grand jury in secret about me. And she is refusing to testify in a grand jury in secret about Julian Assange. So she's in jail for contempt and being charged $1,000 a day fine in addition to the jail, which has almost never been done on anybody for contempt. Okay, so, you know, this is going on. I am not aware, now the material of 2016 for which Assange is not charged, interestingly, or for the CIA stuff he put out, for example, any of that, if it did come from Russia, so what? Was it, nobody has said that the material was wrong, was untrue, was inauthentic. Like in this case, they want to say, where did the whistleblower get the information right now, right? What does that have to do with anything? The president, in other words, is trying to defame as much as he can someone whose name, as far as we know, he doesn't yet know. So he's doing his best with this whistleblower. Well, again, Assange was treated very badly at the time by the New York Times, who said he smelled bad. He was a hacker. He didn't bathe. He stayed up all night. They didn't like him, et cetera, et cetera. Chelsea Manning was defamed by the New York Times in much the same way. So, in short, I don't find that significant. If they, I don't know. You could tell me afterwards, maybe, why that makes a difference. Does it matter whether the Russians did, in fact, intervene in our elections the way we intervene in theirs and we intervene in everybody else's? And have, actually, in Russia, very definitely. But in many other countries. That doesn't make it okay, actually, in all these things. And that's what has not been proven. I mean, the collusion has not been proven. I find it hard to believe there was no collusion there. But Mueller was not able to find any. And indeed, the assertion has been made that the Russians gave the hacked information to Assange. I find that perfectly easy to believe. And yet, not one scrap of evidence has been released on that so far, which is odd somehow. So in short, Assange is an enemy of the people along with the rest of the press in the eyes of Donald J. Trump. And the press had better get off their ass and realize what they have at stake here on this one. He must not be extradited and convicted. And it is, of course, shameful for the British, but they do have an official Secrets Act. If he had done in Britain what was done over here in 2010, open and shut, put him in jail, he's guilty. Is that the country we want? Well, it's the country we have right now, but it's got to change. I hope we can change it.
Okay, let's take one more.
I agree with you, sir, so thank you.
Okay, right there.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your courage. I'm a citizen of Amherst and a lifelong resistor, beginning during the Vietnam War. And one of the things that strikes me about your story is that it's a story of individual, well, not completely individual courage, but definitely, we've been asked to look in the mirror at ourselves and make decisions about what we witness, what we see, what we've encountered. And sometimes
the privilege of positions that we've been in has sometimes allows us to see things that are in the private sector, for example, or private government information. So my question is to you is that the kinds of war that there are sort of warfare has changed in some ways. Warfare has changed in some ways these days, and so in the sense that the profit makers are international, and the atrocities are not secret. They are in the fires and the rising oceans and the people who are dying because of the floods and the rising tides and those sorts of things. So it seems, I'm wondering if you have thought about collective forms of witness, collective forms of civil disobedience that would engage more people, because we are all, in some ways, witnesses to the bio atrocities and the human atrocities of the war, this war upon humanity.
So why don't you all answer, and then that will be our last.
Do you want to go ahead? Go ahead. No, okay. Janaki has raised the question a couple times that I didn't take time to answer, and I will right now. You mentioned the profit aspect. Are they international? Well, yeah, dollars are international reserve currency. That's why our relations to Saudi Arabia and so forth. Gar made me aware in a piece he wrote a few years ago, and I won't go into it now, on how the possession of nuclear weapons made it possible for us to resolve the German problem in a particular way in Europe that we would not have tried to do or would not have done otherwise. Because of our monopoly at that time of the nuclear weapon made us decide to divide Germany and rearm it. And why rearm it? Mainly as a way, as a book called Peddlers of Crisis has shown very clearly, the necessity of getting dollars to Germany right after West Germany, right after the war, which could only be done with a Republican Congress by rearming it, basically by offshore procurement and by arming, because the Republicans were not about to renew the Marshall Plan, which had not been enough to reconstruct Germany without its going left, without having a recession that would bring social democrats into power and even communists in a coalition government in the West in various ways, in order to assure, in other words, that West Germany and West Europe remained a profitable market for investment and for trade and whatever. We had to rearm Germany to get the dollars over there. Looking a little more even broadly than that, I've become convinced, in part by a book I can refer you to by Kofsky. Do you know Frank Kofsky's book? Harry Truman and the War Scare of 1948. The aerospace industry was going bankrupt in 1946 because the huge orders, thousands a month or so of bombers, had stopped, gone to zero in one day practically with the end of the war. GM and Ford, who made most of the bombers, went back to building cars very happily. Lockheed, Boeing, North American, the others were about to go bankrupt. And the only way they could stay and keep an aerospace industry going and so forth was government orders for warplanes. And the only country that had enough targets for a large air force, even one armed with atom bombs, was Russia. And that was as early as 46, even 45, 47. It had to be a big market. I will not try to argue the case, I'll just say it in kind of in answer to Janaki's question in a way. I increasingly think that the Cold War was in considerable part a marketing campaign for an annual huge subsidy to the aerospace industry every year since, and up till this year. And there's a piece of news today on that, by the way, about Boeing, the ill-fated makers of the 737 MAX, and Northrop Grumman today in the news. There's a suit going on about building ICBMs. There is no reason in the world for the US, which has had submarine launch missiles for over half a century, that made ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, totally obsolete and dangerous. The hair trigger, because they have to get off the ground, because they're vulnerable, in the event of warning, of false alarm. They are the hair trigger to the doomsday machine Gar was talking about. There is no excuse for them for the last 50 years, including today, except that Boeing and Lockheed and Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Alperovitz need those orders. And that's a huge part of it. And by the way, Russia, of course, has its own military-industrial complex now with the same kind of profit motives in addition to the bureaucratic and service motives they've always had, as we do. And so why is Russia building these ICBMs? They can come up with an excuse that isn't worth shit any more than ours are, for pretty much the same reasons as we're doing them. So that is a major reason for all that. But when you say, is there a chance for collective action to combat all this, it's very challenging. How do we keep moving from military to climate? How do we keep the oil in the ground where it has to be? It has to go to zero by 2050. You know, or as Rob, and by the way, when people thank me over here for my being here, I am here because Robert Popham wanted my archive.
I'm going to take the opportunity to say that there are other people here that brought the annual Ellsberg in the papers. And the first one is Janaki Perez,
Yeah.
Paul J. Former Deputy Chancellor Bob Feldman, and our Chancellor, Sue Bismarck. This is not the type of thing that chancellors just do on the spot, and I might as well inform you now that the way it happened after Paul J. and Charmany told me about the papers, I had lunch with Chancellor Feldman. And I said, do you think the Chancellor would be interested in this? And I thought, maybe I'll hear in a few weeks, maybe yes, maybe no. Well, 2 hours later, the answer was yes. And that's why the paper.
I want to give the other, my co-conspirators here a chance to talk. I have to respond to one thing about the collective thing. I mentioned earlier, by the way, that strike. And I think the day will come, and must come, when people are educated enough and aware enough that general strikes become available as a means of countering the corporations and the influence of the corporations. But one thing, one person after another, and this is familiar, has talked about me as an individual. Now, it was not just to be polite and so forth, that I am saying that there were people right in this audience sitting next to me, Randy Keeler and Janaki, Gar, without whom nothing would have happened. But it's not just 5 people either. The fact is that when the Pentagon Papers came out, they had no effect on the war. They affected people thinking about the war, but they were already against the war, the majority of it. Nixon wasn't paying any attention to that. A year after the Pentagon Papers came out, while I'm still on trial, was the heaviest bombing of the war in 1972. And Christmas, the heaviest week of bombing in human history. I thought, nothing has been accomplished, anything. The movement of which I'm part and which inspired me has had no effect, not me or anybody else. Here we are bombing, at the greatest time. Now, It did look, just 2 months later, 1 month later, the American troops are out. But that did not mean the war was ending, and I knew it didn't mean that. I knew that Nixon intended to bring the bombing back in support of ARVN, our paid army that had earlier served the French, now served us, in Vietnam, to keep the war going. And indeed, he did intend, he even gave an order to do that in April. Without John Dean telling on the president the way the whistleblower did, at first though without documents, nothing would have changed. But John Dean's word was against the president's, and nothing would have happened. The president was being believed. I tried to get people convinced that this president was doing what his 4 predecessors had done in the way of lies and escalation. And I had the documents on those 4. Without the documents, nobody believed me, essentially, that Nixon was following in the same trend. Without Alex Butterfield revealing he was a handful of people who knew, including Haldeman, but not Ehrlichman, who was up on the screen, did not know there was taping, that he was being taped in the Oval Office. Kissinger did not know he was being taped in the Oval Office. Butterfield, who helped install the system, told Congress, and chose to tell it, actually, about the taping. That would have had no effect if Elliot Richardson had not refused to fire the special prosecutor, had to resign. Then Ruckelshaus refused, had to resign. Cox is fired that night by Bork, 3 people down, the Saturday night massacre. Without that, without a new special prosecutor, Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have continued till 1977, till he got out, and possibly much later. And then after that, there was more. The Supreme Court, including people that Nixon had appointed, had to unanimously say, you have to give the tapes, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm saying, I've said there are 5 people here, including me, but 4 others here that you're seeing, who had to do something extraordinary which put each of them at risk. Randy was not at newly risk, he was in prison. But definitely until this day, Gar and Janaki definitely were at risk. All the people who gave us rooms were at risk at that point of jail. But none of this would have made any difference if about 50, I'm saying out of the air, 50 other people had not done something they were not expected to do, that was very unusual, that risked their careers and so forth. Each one of them was essential, in addition to millions of people who either voted or protested in the streets, in the service, were part of the veterans and the service members' resistance and so forth. All of those people were in the mass necessary, but as individuals, one of them, they weren't essential. But maybe 100 people were essential. So Patricia and I were one link in that chain. It wasn't individuals. Yeah, without that, Nixon would have stayed in office. And without this, and that other person, no effect. All you can say is, not one of us thought we were ending the war. I think that's fair to say. When Randy Keeler refused to send back his change of address to the draft board, putting him in jail for a couple of years. He didn't, I think I can speak for you, Randy, you did not think that was going to end the war or make a significant difference. It was often thought afterwards that I must have had the delusion that I was going to end the war with the Pentagon Papers. No, I wasn't delusional on that. I thought there was a small chance it might help. And Randy's example and 5,000 other people's example told me it's worth going to prison to have a small, non-zero chance of having an effect on this. So not one of us could foresee where this was going to go, and it wouldn't have gone anywhere without all the others. And yet, it did happen. And Nixon was out. The war ends, 1975, 4 years after the Pentagon Papers are out. but the war ends, and would not have ended without all those people. So you can't know what difference it will make. To do the right thing, to analyze, to see what's behind this, to try to educate other people as both Gar and Janaki have spent their lives doing, educating other people to the nature, to what the problem is. And it will not guarantee when that it will make a difference. When Greta says, Thunberg, if people knew, if they were aware, if they awakened to the science, they would demand, they would make a change. I'm sorry, she's 16. I'm 88. I don't have that confidence that they will, but I know it's possible.
Yes.
And everything depends on those possibilities. So in that sense, it is up to each of us.
That's about as good place to end as I know, but I will add a footnote, not an ending. First, there's a mass movement going on around climate change. There's a mass movement going on around the grounds up for how to change the economy. This doesn't get as much press, but we follow it very closely. There is something building up, but my one footnote on this, I'm from Wisconsin, and I lived during the period when Joe McCarthy lived in Wisconsin. And I was in high school then, and they shot anything that moved politically. I mean, you just couldn't move. And people were very down, just as people are down about Trump, and scared stiff that something worse would happen. I mean, Roy Cohn was right on top of you. And so anybody who said you could actually change something, or change the war, or change the system, that was crazy. And then the next day, the 60s broke open. So it is, the message is, get off the chair and let's do it. Basically, history can be built. Do not let the clouds that are coming out of the White House fog you over. The action is, let's go do it. And I think there's a lot going on. It's very interesting right beneath the surface that we can build on.
Sorry, you're almost out of here. I want to thank you very much indeed for adding me at the last moment. But I do want to say to the last speaker that that we really have to examine the nature and the basis of a mass or a group or a collective. Because one of the things I've found at the answer to the last question of our having to make collectives, of course, but we have to examine it, because I've found in many institutions, from ashramas to everywhere other place, that we can teach fascism sitting in a circle. So let's be very, very clear about what is the substance of what we want, and let's examine what the world is that we want to have. Thank you very much.